Welcome back to Thinking Global channel. Today we're diving deep into what might be one of the most hypocritical and economically destructive moves of Trump's presidency so far, his decision to weaponize trade policy against India, imposing crushing 50% tariffs, not because of unfair trade practices, but because India dared to exercise its fundamental sovereign right to prioritize its relations with Russia. But this story goes far deeper than simple trade disputes. This is a masterclass in how the American empire operates, creating crises, profiting from the solutions, then punishing those who helped when it no longer serves Washington's interests. It's about economic coercion as a tool of imperial control, the hypocrisy of American foreign policy, and most importantly, how one of the world's largest democracies is refusing to bow to imperial pressure. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to dissect this economic warfare, examine the staggering hypocrisy behind it, analyze who really gets hurt by these policies, and explore what this tells us about the decline of American hegemony and the rise of a truly multipolar world order. Let's start by understanding the mechanics of what Trump has done. We're looking at 50% tariffs on most imports from India. That's not a trade adjustment. That's economic warfare. This breaks down into two phases. First, 25% tariffs imposed in early August after trade negotiations failed. Then an additional 25% specifically as punishment for India's continued purchases of Russian oil. Now, the first set of tariffs came after India refused to open up sectors like agriculture and dairy to American businesses. Think about that for a moment. The United States, which subsidizes its own agricultural sector to the tune of billions of dollars annually, demanded that India, a country where agriculture employs nearly half the population, open up these sectors to American competition. When India said no, protecting its farmers and food security, Trump slapped on the tariffs. This is textbook economic imperialism, demanding that developing nations dismantle the very protections that developed nations use to build their own economies. The United States built its industrial base behind high tariff walls in the 19th century, but now demands that other countries practice free trade, while it increasingly abandons those principles itself. But the second tranche of tariffs, the 25% penalty for buying Russian oil, this is where the hypocrisy reaches truly staggering levels. Because for years, Washington not only tolerated, but actively encouraged India to buy Russian oil. Here's where this story gets really rich. Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, what might be one of the most devastating diplomatic takedowns in recent memory, pointed out that Americans actually encouraged India to do everything to stabilize world markets, including purchasing Russian energy. Let's put this in context. After the Ukraine conflict began in 2022, global energy markets were in chaos. Oil prices were spiking, threatening to trigger a global recession. What did Washington do? They quietly encouraged countries like India to continue buying Russian oil at a discount, under a price cap mechanism, to keep global energy prices stable. Former U.S. Ambassador to India Eric Garcetti explicitly stated that India's purchases of Russian oil were not a violation or anything, explaining that Washington wanted New Delhi to buy Russian oil at a price cap. The Americans were perfectly happy with India serving as a pressure valve for global energy markets. But here's the beautiful contradiction. India is not even the biggest purchaser of Russian oil. That's China, which accounts for a much larger share of Russian energy exports. India is not the biggest buyer of Russian LNG either. That's the European Union, which despite all its sanctions rhetoric, continues to import significant amounts of Russian energy. So why target India specifically? Because China represents an economic threat that the U.S. can't simply bully. It's too big. It's integrated into global supply chains, and frankly, too important to American companies' bottom lines. Europe is a military ally that Washington needs for its broader geopolitical projects. India, however, represents something far more dangerous to the imperial mindset. A large, economically significant country that refuses to align its foreign policy with American interests. India practices what it calls strategic autonomy, maintaining relationships with all major powers based on its own national interests, rather than ideological alignment. This is intolerable to an imperial power that demands not just compliance, but enthusiastic participation in its global projects. It's not enough for India to be a partner. it must be a subordinate. Let's dive into the actual economic impact of these tariffs, because the numbers tell a fascinating story about who really gets hurt by economic warfare. Trump's tariffs affect a wide range of Indian exports: gems and jewelry, seafood, textiles, machinery, metals like steel and aluminum, organic chemicals, agricultural products, leather handicrafts, furniture, and carpets. Some of India's most competitive industries are getting hammered. The Gem and Jewelry Export Promotion Council says the tariffs will have far-reaching repercussions across the economy, disrupting critical supply chains, stalling exports, and threatening thousands of jobs. The U.S. is India's single largest market for gems and jewelry, accounting for over $10 billion in exports, nearly 30% of the industry's total global trade. The shrimp export sector is particularly vulnerable, with the U.S. accounting for 48% of its revenue. India is the world's largest exporter of basmati rice, and price hikes in the U.S. could mean major market share losses. Trade group GTRI estimates these tariffs could result in a decline of $18.6 billion and a 43% overall drop in shipments to the U.S., potentially putting hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk. But here's the crucial context, and this is where the imperial strategy backfires spectacularly. The State Bank of India notes that U.S. trade accounts for only 2% of India's GDP. That means India can absorb this hit relatively easily. While the damage to specific sectors can be offset through market diversification, meanwhile, what happens to American consumers? Nobel laureate Paul Krugman has noted that key U.S. economic data is taking on an increasingly stagflationary tone. And there's widespread consensus among economists that tariffs fuel inflation. With U.S. inflation at 2.7%, these tariffs could potentially push inflation up by nearly 75% of the current rate in the short term. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has admitted what economists have known all along. U.S. citizens pay the price for tariffs, not the countries being penalized. So Trump is inflicting more pain on American families than on the Indian economy he's trying to punish. It's not strategic thinking. That's imperial tantrum throwing that damages your own interests. India's response to this economic bullying has been nothing short of masterful. Offering a template for how sovereign nations should respond to imperial pressure, Foreign Minister Jaishankar's comeback was diplomatically brutal. If you have a problem buying oil or refined products from India, don't buy it. Nobody forces you to buy it. Europe buys. America buys. So you don't like it? Don't buy it. This isn't just diplomatic sass. It's a declaration of economic sovereignty that cuts to the heart of imperial assumptions. The underlying message is clear. India will not subordinate its national interests to American geopolitical objectives. If Washington doesn't like that, it can find other suppliers. Prime Minister Modi has turned this crisis into an opportunity, calling for increased self-reliance and telling citizens to follow the mantra of buying only Made in India goods. He's acknowledged that India may face pressure from the tariffs, but stated the country is willing to endure it. This is real leadership, not the performative kind we see so often, but the kind that says we will protect our sovereignty even if it costs us in the short term. Modi is using American economic aggression as a catalyst for exactly what Washington fears most: Indian economic independence. India is also planning to reduce its consumption tax by October, when the country celebrates Diwali, the Hindu festival of lights that coincides with India's largest shopping period. They're using fiscal policy to offset the tariff impact while strengthening domestic consumption. But perhaps most importantly, Jaishankar has been educating the global public about American hypocrisy. In his press conference with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Moscow, he systematically dismantled the American position, pointing out that India had helped stabilize global energy markets, that it wasn't the biggest buyer of Russian energy, and that Americans had explicitly encouraged these purchases. This kind of diplomatic transparency, explaining your position clearly and exposing the contradictions in your opponent's arguments, is devastating to imperial narratives that depend on information control and moral authority. One of the most fascinating aspects of this story is how American corporations are quietly rejecting Trump's imperial overreach. The most visible example is Apple's defiance of direct presidential pressure. Apple is not just continuing its India operations, it's massively expanding them. The company is planning to invest about $2.5 billion to boost iPhone production in India, increasing annual production from 40 million to 60 million phones. During Apple's quarterly earnings call, CEO Tim Cook said the majority of iPhones sold in the U.S. will have India as their country of origin. When Trump explicitly told Cook, "I don't want you building in India," Apple essentially told the president to take a hike. An Indian government source confirmed that Apple's expansion plans will continue as previously envisaged. Why would Apple defy the president so directly? Because smart businesses understand that diversifying away from over-reliance on any single market, including the U.S., is essential for long-term survival. Apple exported $17 billion worth of iPhones from India last year and has secured significant market share in India's domestic premium smartphone sector. The exemption of smartphones, computers, and electronics from the tariffs reveals the incoherence of this policy. If the goal was really to pressure India over Russian oil purchases, why exempt major categories of imports? The answer is that even the Trump administration knows that completely disrupting these supply chains would hurt American companies and consumers too much. This selective application of tariffs shows that this is more about political theater than coherent economic strategy. It's performative aggression designed to look tough while avoiding the sectors where American business interests would be seriously damaged. To understand what's really happening here, we need to zoom out and look at the broader pattern of American behavior. Economic coercion has become Washington's preferred tool of foreign policy, used against any country that dares to pursue an independent path. This isn't new. The United States has been using economic warfare for decades. What's new is how crude and obvious it's become, and how ineffective it's proving to be. Think about the countries currently under U.S. sanctions or economic pressure: Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, Syria. The list goes on. The common thread isn't human rights or democratic values. It's independence from American control. Meanwhile, countries with terrible human rights records, but strategic alignment with Washington, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, face no economic pressure at all. Pattern is clear: fall in line with American foreign policy or face economic consequences. But this strategy is increasingly failing because the global economic landscape has fundamentally changed. When the U.S. was the dominant global economy with few alternatives, economic coercion was devastatingly effective. Today, countries have options. India can sell its products to Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It can buy energy from Russia, the Middle East, and increasingly renewable sources. It can access capital from Japanese, European, and increasingly domestic sources. Economist Jeffrey Sachs called Trump's tariffs the stupidest tactical move in U.S. foreign policy and a self-destructive act that undermines American strategic interests. But from an imperial perspective, it makes a certain twisted sense. Better to damage your own economy than allow other countries to exercise true sovereignty. The problem is that this approach accelerates exactly what Washington is trying to prevent: the emergence of alternative economic systems that bypass American control. What we're witnessing is not just a trade dispute, but a fundamental shift in global economic architecture. India's response to American economic coercion is part of a broader pattern of countries building alternative systems that reduce dependence on Western-controlled institutions. India is a founding member of BRICS, which now includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with recent expansions to include Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, UAE, and Indonesia. BRICS countries are working on alternative payment systems, trade mechanisms, and development financing that bypass dollar-denominated transactions. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, these aren't just economic projects. They're the infrastructure of a multipolar world order where American approval is no longer required for international commerce. India's Look East policy has increased trade with Southeast Asia. Its partnerships with Africa are growing rapidly. Trade with Latin America is expanding. All of this reduces the relative importance of the U.S. market and therefore the effectiveness of American economic coercion. When Jaishankar says nobody forces you to buy it, it's not just talking about oil or textiles. He's talking about the fundamental principle that trade should be based on mutual benefit. It's not geopolitical subordination. This is what the decline of empire looks like, not military defeat, but the gradual erosion of economic leverage as alternative systems emerge and countries find they can prosper without imperial approval. Trump's economic warfare against India is ultimately a symptom of a much larger phenomenon: the thrashing of a declining empire that can no longer maintain control through soft power and economic attraction, so it's resorting to increasingly crude forms of coercion. But coercion only works when you have overwhelming leverage, and that leverage is slipping away. Every time Washington uses economic pressure to try to force compliance, it demonstrates to other countries that depending on American markets and institutions is a strategic vulnerability. The result is exactly what we're seeing: countries diversifying their economic relationships, building alternative institutions, and reducing their dependence on systems that can be weaponized against them. India's calm, dignified response to American economic aggression sends a powerful message to other countries. You don't have to accept bullying from Washington. You can maintain your sovereignty, protect your national interests, and prosper in a multipolar world. The age of unchallenged American hegemony is ending, and moves like Trump's tariffs are only accelerating its demise. The question isn't whether a multipolar world order will emerge, it's how much damage the declining empire will inflict on everyone, including itself, as it tries to maintain its fading dominance. Countries around the world are watching how India handles this pressure, and they're drawing conclusions about the reliability of the United States as an economic partner. They're seeing that even close partners can face sudden economic warfare. If they don't toe the line on every aspect of foreign policy, this is not the behavior of a confident superpower. It's the desperate lashing out of an empire that knows its time of absolute dominance is coming to an end. Trump's tariff war against India reveals everything wrong with American foreign policy in the 21st century. It's hypocritical, economically destructive, and ultimately self-defeating. It punishes American consumers, alienates strategic partners, and accelerates the very multipolar world order that Washington is trying to prevent. India's response? Economic self-reliance, diplomatic independence, and a refusal to bow to imperial pressure offers a roadmap for other countries. Tired of being treated as vassals in the American empire, the future belongs to countries that can maintain their sovereignty while building mutually beneficial relationships with all major powers. India is showing how it's done, and the world is taking notes. What do you think? Are we witnessing the beginning of the end of American economic imperialism? How should other countries respond to similar pressure? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel to keep thinking the world how it really is.